Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Psychology and Spirituality, a Bridge to a Better Life discussion. I'm your host, Marcia Trajano, and with me are three amazing guests. I'm here with our special guest, Dr. Lionel Corbett, and Dr. Anahy Fonseca, and Jussara Korngold. If this is the first time you're watching this podcast like program, please note that our program, the Psychology and Spirituality Weekly Talks, are based on the works by Joanna de Angelis, and they offer a safe space to confront, compare, correlate, and expand spirituality concepts from a psychological lens, bringing perhaps insights, tips, real world advice to help you and me lead a better life. I'm so excited to be here today, Professor Corbett, Dr. Anahy, Jussara. I would like for you to share your points of view in a informal conversation around a big topic, human suffering, and perhaps some highlight on spiritual approaches to how we address them. Before we start our conversation in earnest, I would like to recognize the organizations that are sponsoring this program: Mansão do Caminho, the United States Spiritist Federation, the International Spiritist Council, and AMI Brazil. Make sure you hit subscribe if you haven't already done so. And if you'd like to check out some other channels, please do so by going to www.spiritist.us. If you have any questions, please write them down. We'd love to address them at a later episode. Dr. Corbett, I just want to tell you, I loved reading your book, Soul in Anguish, where you provided some insightful examination on suffering and its effects, for example, on our personality. I want to thank you first and foremost. I want to invite all of you who are here in the audience to read the book as well. But right at the beginning, in the introduction, you mentioned that perhaps the suffering is unique to the individual, and there is no objective way of view human suffering, and that we make sense of the world in a way that takes our suffering into account. Lots to unpack there, but I thought we could start our conversation today with that. Would you mind commenting on that?
Yes. I was trying to make the point that suffering is inevitable. All human beings suffer. And broadly speaking, we can take 2 points of view. We can say, well, this is just the tragic side of life. It just is the way life is. Or we can say that there is some kind of intelligent background to what happens to us. And in that case, some kind of spiritual or philosophical approach to suffering is very helpful. Some kind of framework which will give us a perspective on suffering. Those are really the two broad points of view. So I don't know where you'd like to pick up on that. Do you want to focus on the spiritual dimension of it?
I just thought we could just start with that conversation, and perhaps if we can think about it, right? Suffering is unique, and there's that framework that we need to perhaps structure how we view our own suffering. But before we move on to anything, perhaps Anahy and or Jussara, you can also comment on that before we move on, because I have a couple other questions that I would like to ask here.
Well, I would like, if it's possible, for Lionel to discuss a little bit more, to talk a little bit more, because, for instance, we know that nowadays we have Dr. Google, right? So people go to the Google and put their symptoms, and they want to know their diagnosis, and they like to classify themselves or friends, family. I am this and that, and I think it's great the way that Lionel puts in his book that suffering is unique to the individual, and also that our the way that we understand the world is, of course, influenced by our suffering, can be influenced by our suffering. So, what do you think, Lana, about all this classification and diagnosis that people are doing here in Brazil? For instance, Instagram, it's a big thing. Everybody's talking, even psychologists and psychiatrists. I would love to know your ideas of all this.
Yeah, I don't think classification or diagnosis is really much help. First of all, there are a lot of different types of suffering have nothing to do with mental illness. You won't find them in a psyche. You won't find it, the kind of suffering that the individual is going through in a psychiatric textbook very often. Suffering is not always the result of pathology or something wrong with one. Very often it's a matter of circumstance that we're in. So we need some kind of broad way of thinking about suffering. So, I mean, we could start to talk about some strategies for dealing with it. For example, one of the commonest strategies, one of the ones that Jung deploys, is to find meaning in the suffering. Because people very often ask questions like, why is this happening to me when they're ill? Some tragedy strikes, or they say, what have I done to deserve this? And especially if you're a religious person, you wonder, a lot of people wonder whether they're being punished in some way, whether this is some kind of divine retribution, that kind of thing. And very often, if people have had a religious practice all their life and then suddenly they're suffering unexpectedly, it may call their spiritual practice into question. They may wonder, have I been worshiping the wrong God or something like that? So sometimes you need to develop an entirely new image of God. You need to think about what Jung called the dark side of God, which is typically the way Christians think about God. Or you have to find some other type of meaning in what's going on. So maybe we could begin with this question of, can suffering be meaningful the way Jung thinks it can be? He thinks that if you can find meaning in suffering, it makes suffering tolerable that would otherwise be unbearable. I wonder what you think about that. Is that reasonable or not?
And I love the question back, right? And what are your thoughts? And I'd love to hear from Jussara as
Yeah,
well.
well, when I was reading again some parts of Lionel's book, we are here, Lionel, in this podcast. We talk a lot about Joanna de Angelis and her view in psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And she says something that you said in your book, and I think it's great. You just developed also what, and I agree with you and with Jung, that you quote Jung that the suffering that necessarily attaches to life cannot be evaded, right?
Mm-hmm.
And then you comment that from this suffering, human advances and creativity arise from suffering.
Mm-hmm.
And you say that you quote Jung that there is no birth of consciousness without pain in the collected works that Jung talks about that. And Joanna de Angelis says the same thing, to expand consciousness. And you were talking about the God image, the way that we understand God. And we are, of course, throughout our lifetime, we are going to question many times because everybody suffers, is part of
Mm-hmm.
our being here and living and developing consciousness. So I agree. I think it's very important that, and I talked about Dr. Google and all the going for in the search of diagnosis and treatments, okay? Because it's like nobody can suffer nowadays. I have to be in
Yes.
the social medias. I have to be happy. I have to, to be famous or be successful. And we are here talking in Lionel's great book that suffering is part of not only of life, of our complexity, of our psyche, and that we need in a certain way. It leads us to this search of meaning that leads us to uh, develop or expand our consciousness.
Yeah, suffering is not always a bad thing. We want to get rid of it as quickly as possible, but it's also important to ask, what does this mean? Uh, is this a part of my life in some important way? Is it sending me a message, for example? That was Jung's view. Jung thought that when you're suffering, that this is like a message that something needs attention. So suffering is not always abnormal. It's not always psychopathology. It doesn't always mean that you need a diagnosis. It means you need to look into what's going on in your life and explore what it means very often. But I wonder whether you think that's reasonable, or whether you think that's a rationalization. I mean, some people think that there is no meaning in suffering. It's just random misfortune, the tragic side of life.
Well, I was leaving to the end, but you also in chapter 6, when we talk about spiritual and religious approaches to suffering, you cite Freud in The Future of an Illusion, okay? And of course, we all know, and everybody that is watching us, probably they all know also that Freud puts religion and spirituality as a big defense mechanism, right? An attempt to deal with our fear of death. And but I think it's great the way that you talk about Lionel, that even though for many people can be a defense, right? For
Mm.
our helplessness and our fear of dying, it doesn't disprove the reality, you say, of a spiritual dimension of reality, or it doesn't disprove this assumption of a spiritual dimension of reality. And but what was your question? I got so excited about talking that I
Well,
forgot.
you were actually on track, because Freud thought that religion is just, when you say that suffering has meaning, that
Yeah.
there's some larger transpersonal intelligence behind your suffering. You could call it God or spirit, or some other name. There's some kind of intelligent ordering principle behind what happens to us. Freud would say that's just a rationalization. Life is just tragic, and people who say there is some meaning in it are just defending against the pain that they're having.
May I say something else, Professor
Yeah.
Corbett? Because I think it's quite interesting. If we bring suffering and we bring the complexity of not just suffering in its one-to-one, very multidimensional, because we're billions of people and each one of us are unique and we suffer in a unique manner, in this counters to not just the Freud's idealization idea that we are rationalizing it to be able to escape from the suffering, but also, which I believe is more of a Western view of suffering, which is let's put a diagnostics into it. Let's see suffering with whatever means necessary. Let's find either a pill or a therapy that will diminish it without looking at all the opportunities for driving from or getting to the results that the suffering would lead to you from that the consciousness perspective. So I think it's very quite interesting what we're talking here, and I just cannot thank you enough for how beautifully you put such a difficult question, which is suffering. The subject of your entire book is suffering, right? And I believe all of us here have read it. So we're really really interested in picking your brain a little bit on those meanings, right? But knowing that there is this Western propensity that is exacerbated today, as Anahy is mentioned. It's not just Brazil, right? To go to WebMD or Dr. Google or any source of um, modern day witchery on fixing a source of pain. Doesn't matter how, we just want to fix that. And instead, here in today's discussion, we're here. Let's talk about meaning, the meaning behind suffering. How can we really look into it from a spiritual lens as well as depth psychology?
Yeah. And there, of course, there are different sources of meaning. I mean, when let's say you become ill or you have a loss, a death, or some major tragedy like that, um, you can ask yourself, the way Jung would approach this is he would ask, where is this suffering or this problem taking you that otherwise you wouldn't go? How is this suffering
Yeah,
changing the direction, the course of your life? And that's a very major question because, you know the old joke about how you make God laugh is by making plans. So the ego has all kinds of plans about the way I want my life to go. And then
uh-huh.
something happens. And of course, then the ego becomes what we call radically relativized. The ego
Mhm.
realizes it's not in charge, that there's
Yes.
this other intelligence going on. And then you have a question, do you want to fight it? Do you want to surrender? Do you want to try to understand it? That's what I'm trying to get at. How do you address the issue?
Yeah, yeah, love it. I'm going to punt to Jussara. Jussara, do you want to talk about how do we address that? What are your thoughts?
First of all, I would like to say to Professor Corbett, what an honor it is to have you here with us. I hope you can come other times as well. And thank you so much for everything that you have been bringing and this partnership with Dr. Anahy as well, for us to go deeper into the understanding of psychotherapy, and also for your book that is absolutely amazing. I've been learning so much with it. I have highlighted so many passages that I think we would be here a year if we were to cover each one of them. But more straight going into this point of the meaning of suffering, there are so many passages in the book that you yourself address it in terms of, first of all, explaining how the DSM cannot uh, 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 focus or give an answer for every kind of suffering that we see. And also, I think in chapter 2, you mentioned something that is so important because in terms of the suffering that is a byproduct of our painful emotions that we could prevent. And all of that is very similar to the spiritual perspective. Because what can I learn from these negative emotions that I will have towards others that makes me suffer? It's very clear that it's saying it's in your hands, you can prevent it. So there are many ways of suffering or challenges, many things that we go through because we ourselves are the one putting ourselves into trouble. And
Mhm.
again, quoting your book, and when you mentioned Jung, sorry, there is no birth of consciousness without pain. I had the opportunity of visiting his home in Switzerland. And when I was taken to his office where he would do his psychotherapy sessions, I was very intrigued by the stained glass that he has in his office. And there was an old lady, and I asked her, was it him that chose this stained glass. Why is it here? Because it was a passage from the Calvary, from Jesus, going to the cross, being crucified, and then the resurrection. And she told me, that's what she told me, that it was because he thought that this process of liberation, birth of consciousness, was very similar to going to the Golgotha, to the Calvary. So it means we see here, through this spiritual perspective, that although we do not need to go to suffering, and the majority of them could be preventive, if we would take more care of our health, if we would take more care of our emotions, the ones and the moment they come to us, they will be a red flag. They will kind of indicate to us a path to track. But I think one of the things that you said that I think it impacted me a lot was right at the beginning, that when we suffer intensely, we may view the world through the lens of our suffering. And so I was wondering if this pessimistic wave that we are seeing all over is not the result of that, the growing pains, this birth of consciousness that at the same time, make us go to this conclusion that everyone is going through this suffering. So,
Thank you, Jussara. Yes, go ahead, Professor Corbett.
I'm not sure if your question was, when we look at the suffering that's going on in the world all around us, is that producing a new consciousness? Is that what you were getting at?
Yes. The birth of consciousness, and of course, due to the so many challenges that we are all facing, if this is so, of course, we will find a wave of pessimism around, because I'm seeing the world like I'm feeling, right?
But it doesn't seem that human beings are learning from experience, does it? I mean, we keep repeating the same wars and conflict that we've had since the beginning of the species. So I'm not really sure if a new consciousness is being born. I think a new God image is being born. I'd be happy to talk about that if you want. But I'm not sure that in the collective that consciousness is really being raised very much. I'm sorry to sound pessimistic.
I hear you, Professor Corbett. It feels that it's all around us, this wave of pessimism. Yeah.
Jussara mentioned the Christian perspective, but remember, there's very often a crucifixion, but no resurrection for many people. They just feel chronically crucified. It's always, there is no resurrection. That the Christian model is an important, valuable model, but it's not the only model. We have to look at some others.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, well, maybe here we can come with spiritist knowledge, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Because, Lionel and I think Jussara and Marcia and some people that know our work, that we are investigating the collective unconscious. We have a research of anomalous experiences seeing and being analyzed through Jung's complex psychology. And we have gathered, for instance, there's a lot of interest nowadays in anomalous experiences such as near-death experiences and mediumistic and paranormal experiences. And I have been hearing a lot of podcasts also in English in the United States, a lot of people talking about that. And putting everything together, also in this chapter 6, Lionel talks about William James, Lionel. And you say that when you talk about his views, some of his views, that the evil facts may be the best, citing William James, the evil facts may be the best key to life significance and possibly the only openers of our eyes to the deepest levels of truth. So maybe we are, I don't know how to say, in the center of the hurricane,
At the
when there is like a silence and a suffering, feeling the suffering, and having to deal with all this shadow and this evil in the world. But the hurricane, the twister, whatever is there, and the winds are blowing really strongly. So we kind of are a pair of two double cups, Lionel. One that it's positive and one is negative sometimes, but I think it's in the middle of this, of our world vision, because we have different experiences. And I think it's very interesting to to pay attention to this. Okay, I'm not looking at the real thing that things that act behaviors of different people, still wars at this point, and that's so crazy. It's senseless with everything that we have learned. I totally agree with Lionel from past wars, and there's no sense at all. Only interested, and we know that, of power, money, things like that, and this is all ego. But at the same time, when we analyze people's anomalous spiritual experiences, we can see this kind of birth of consciousness that Jussara was talking about. We can find people are maybe starting psychologically looking for this expansion of consciousness. If this could be a way, from psychological point of view, to understand, Lionel, this wish for going beyond our shadows. Of course, we have to acknowledge our shadows, but going beyond, having an understanding that we can expand our consciousness. I would love you and Jussara and maybe Marcia to comment on that.
Let me clarify here that when I was mentioning, this birth of consciousness, I was mentioning the words of Jung that Professor Corbett talks about in the book, where Jung mentions that, this the birth of consciousness will not happen without pain. So I was thinking about that in terms of this inner suffering that refers to the need that me as a soul in anguish have to look at myself and face and face my actions and face my thoughts and everything that is leading me to conform with the circumstances of life, or to keep on going into giving myself to behaviors that I know is going to be detrimental, hurtful to me at the end. Or if I go into a process of self-knowledge, right, this is spirit consciousness awakening, so that I can start seeing myself in a different perspective, the reason for being, and with that grow, which is not, of course, that easy, because this whole process, why is it painful? And I think it's wonderful, Professor Corbett, that you mentioned. So far we just see the cross, and we don't see people in this stage of the resurrection, because we are still dealing with this pain, with the realization. I guess many of us are still trying to bargain, but do I really have to do that? Do I really have to retrain my thoughts. It's so painful. It's so different. It's not appreciate. There was another phrase that we put it in the book that I think it refers. It could refer as well, from my perspective, to people that are going through this process of the birth of consciousness, which is, you say, many suffering people are marginalized. So people that are suffering, we don't want to see that in the media. We don't want to see that in our Instagram, Facebook, etc. It seems like it's contagious, but at the same time, people that have somehow awakened to a new reality of oneself is also marginalized. So it is a different kind of pain. I'm just throwing a lot of here for for you to.
It's a good topic, right? Lots and lots of approaches to this topic. Go ahead,
Well,
Professor Corbett.
the Gethsemane experience is this whole problem of, do I have to go through this?
Maybe, Lionel, I was wondering. I was not saying that it's okay. I think yes, I agree totally with you that, and with Jussara and with Marcia, that the work that we have to do, it's inside.
Mhm.
We have to deal with our own shadows, and like Jussara said, the process of awakening, in the sense of developing. Actually, it's the individuation process and all the concept, Jung's concept of the self, that it's the richness of the depth psychology, and of course includes suffering, because who wants to see its own his her own shadow, right? But what I'm seeing is that I will give it to you, that I have been listening to a lot of podcasts that people are, and some people are saying, Lionel, maybe this is kind of news to you, but since we are actually having to analyze some cases, right, with where this appears, anomalous experiences of extraterrestrials and things like that,
Yeah.
many people are saying that we have inside of us the self, like the higher self. I think
Mhm.
United States, a lot of people talk about Jung's self, would be analogous to what they call, a lot of people call the higher self, a
Mhm.
higher consciousness.
Mhm.
And they tend to talk in podcasts and a lot of YouTube channels as the higher self, something, having something of divine nature
Mhm.
and of like luminous nature, okay,
Isn't
like
that
some.
isn't that what Jung said? I mean, what's new about that? That's
Yeah, it's not new, but it's in the culture, okay.
ah,
But what I think, and I think your contribution, it's really important when you talk about the dark side of the self. In my vision, yes, we have to acknowledge that, as Jung says, but nobody, well, in this podcast, nobody's talking about Jung. So it's like this information is being,
I keep trying to talk about Jung.
yeah, that's why we are here, because I think, as Jung, I totally agree with Jung that we need more psychology. We need more understanding about ourselves, so that this podcast and Joanna's all work is all about that. And so I would just finish, because I would love to see what Jussara wants and you to talk about. But what I'm saying is that maybe some of these people, not all of them, are kind of uh, like bypassing the ego and the shadow and all of our problems. That's my point. Because if I think that I'm only light, I come from the stars, and I'm like, I'm okay. We have a divine nature. I think we can all agree, and Jung agrees with that. But it's not our divine nature that is causing all the problems in the world, wars, and all this shadow, this evil. So I think we cannot bypass the ego and its problems and the shadow. And also what you said, Lionel, when you talk about the dark side of the self, We cannot bypass this. We have to acknowledge, and we have, like Jussara said, it is in Jung's psychotherapy setting, the Christ in the cross, right, Jussara? So these opposite forces that when we suffer, we have to face them. Otherwise, our divine nature is not going to express itself here. We have been struggling with that. Okay, now I want to hear you guys. But just to make clear that I'm not say, not saying that, yes, let's, that I'm Trekker, I'm Star Trek fan, but as Data in the Next Generation, he's always questioning our human nature. He wants to know what it's what's the point of being human, what's our human nature means. So I'll just finish my to give Lionel and Jussara. You said so greatly, Lionel, in chapter 6. Struggling with question is perhaps one way of coping with the problem when we are in this search for meaning and developing our spirituality. So we don't have to have right away answers that calm us down, let's say. We have to struggle with the questions and listen to ourselves, right? Sorry, Jussara, I knew you wanted to talk, and we all want to see what Lionel.
No, this is a lovely topic here today, and we are approaching our time. So I would like for us to explore and comment on that information that you brought. Struggling with questions is perhaps coping with suffering itself. So, Jusada, do
The way I heard, that's why, spoken words are always so complicated, but the way I heard is as if she was trying to say, to me, the way I decodified is like we are looking for another escape mechanism, another way to delegate, to transfer our responsibility, because now the ETs are coming and going to be helping us and doing the work that we haven't done so far. So this is not something that we actually accept or condone in terms of spiritism. The work that we have to do is this work that it is painful. It's like the growing pain of the spirit, and through the different stages we have to the lessons are just before us, before our eyes, and it's up to us to embrace them or not. Otherwise, we are going to be seeing repetition of the same patterns, and that hurts us. That leads us to suffering. And up to when am I going to be, climbing that mountain to the cross, and not just go through the whole process and just come back anew, right? Resurrected in terms of no longer the ego imposing itself on me, and me being guided by my desires, my wings, my negative emotions, but that are the cause of suffering. So I think one of the lessons, and it's very hard for us to face that when we are talking about spiritism and spiritually speaking, is you are the artisan of your life. So pay attention, and many of the suffering can be prevented or even tracked in a way that is not going to be that painful. So, yes.
Professor Corbett, it's on you now.
Well, but isn't the point partly that we're not entirely in charge of our lives? That there is some kind of background intelligence in the universe, and reality is unfolding according to the way it wants reality to unfold. And very often the ego doesn't like the result. Very often the ego says, this is happening and it's causing a great deal of pain. And that's when you have to come to terms with it. I mean, can you surrender? Can you let go? Can you acknowledge that this background intelligence, the self, if you, the higher self, if you like, is running the show? Or, to what extent are we supposed to struggle with it? To what extent are we supposed to surrender? Those are the important questions.
I really appreciate that, right? It's not a simple answer,
No,
but we do need to understand the, I would say, a large percentage of from what I understand here, from our suffering is resulting from the struggle of our ego going against our higher self, our S with a capital S. And I think this is an important lesson for all of us. We're here to debate on the question of suffering and some spiritual components of the suffering, perhaps finding meaning into it, gaining a level of psychological maturity, a spiritual maturity that is a result of the suffering itself. But most importantly, it is all about us, may I say, resigning to it, accepting it, because through it, we overcome it. Does this make sense?
I wouldn't say resign, because resign
Mm,
has a it has an angry, grudging quality to it.
mm-hmm,
If you really accept what's happening as necessary,
mm-hmm,
there's no sense of anger in that. It's simply the experience of feeling that what's happening has to be the way it is. Um, it's not quite the same as resignation, which is
yeah,
more like submission, really. It's not that.
yeah,
It's really embracing the situation as necessary somehow.
yeah. Which changes everything, right? And as it changes, then we're now able to find meaning into that experience. But I'm so sad to say that we are at time. And with that, I want to say thank you so much, Jussara, Dr. Naid, Dr. Corbett. I really appreciate this opportunity. Um, a plug again to Professor Corbett's book, A Soul in English. Delightful, even though the title may be off-putting for some, but is a truly delightful, beautifully crafted, just to me, very, very digestible if you're not a psychologist, just beautifully written and a pleasure to read and to understand the concept of suffering that we all are vulnerable to it, right? Most of us are unable to not be vulnerable. But with that, I want to say goodbye and invite all of you who are here with us today to be with us next time. And thank you very much, everyone.